Imagine surviving decades of exile in Babylon. Your prophets promised that when you returned home, God would restore Jerusalem to unimaginable glory, a righteous king, nations streaming to your temple, a golden age. You finally return and find rubble, poverty, infighting, and a small province under Persian rule. The temple you rebuild is so modest that old men who remember Solomon's temple weep at the sight of it. Those broken promises had two possible fates: abandonment or a radical rewriting of the timeline, pushing hope from history into the end of the world itself. And that second option is the eschatological turn, and it may be the most consequential theological move in Western history. To understand this shift, start with what earlier prophets promised. First Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. They spoke of restoration within recognizable political history, a Davidic king back on the throne, national sovereignty, agricultural abundance, Jerusalem as the center of the world. These were expectations for this world in this lifetime. Then came the return from Babylonian exile around 538 BCE, the post-exilic period, and reality delivered none of it. No king, no sovereignty, economic hardship, communal division over who even counted as a true Israelite. The gap between prophetic promise and lived experience became unbearable. That gap is the engine of what scholars call eschatology, a vision of the end of days when God will decisively and permanently set the world right. Hope migrated from within history to beyond it. The most dramatic response came from an anonymous author whose words were attached to the scroll of Isaiah. Scholars call this writer Third Isaiah, the author of chapters 56 through 66, distinct from the 8th century prophet of chapters 1 through 39, and the exilic voice of chapters 40 through 55. Third Isaiah wrote in the post-exilic period, roughly the late 6th or 5th century BCE. And in chapter 65, verses 17 through 25, this author made an extraordinary claim. God will create a new heaven and a new earth. Jerusalem will be pure joy. Infant mortality will vanish. No one will die young. People will build houses and live in them, plant vineyards and eat their fruit. The wolf and the lamb will graze together. The lion will eat straw like an ox. And a detail easily missed: the serpent's food will be dust. And that reverses the curse of Genesis 3, where God condemned the serpent to eat dust. While Third Isaiah is not describing reform or gradual improvement, this is a reboot of creation itself, a point-by-point reversal of the curses laid down at the very beginning of the biblical story. Pain, toil, death, expulsion from paradise, all undone. Third Isaiah didn't only reimagine creation, he reimagined the community. Deuteronomy 23 bans eunuchs and certain foreigners from the congregation. Ezra and Nehemiah enforced this, expelling foreigners from temple precincts. Third Isaiah pushed back. In chapter 56, foreigners and eunuchs who keep the Sabbath and hold to the covenant will be welcomed on God's holy mountain. The text declares, "My house shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples." The post-exilic community was divided. Third Isaiah represents one voice in an active internal debate. Third Isaiah proposed a reboot. Other late prophets proposed a battle plan. Second Zechariah, chapters 9 through 14 of the book of Zechariah, written by a different anonymous author, probably in the 5th century BCE or later, delivers the most dramatic version. In chapter 14, God gathers all nations against Jerusalem. The city is plundered, inhabitants killed, houses ransacked, half the population dragged into exile. At the absolute nadir, when destruction seems total and irreversible, God steps onto the battlefield. Yahweh fights against the nations. The Mount of Olives splits in two. Living waters flow from Jerusalem. Then the transformation. Jerusalem rises above all surrounding cities. Surviving nations make annual pilgrimage to worship there. Yahweh becomes sovereign over the entire earth. The text states it plainly: "The Lord shall be king over all the earth. On that day, the Lord shall be one, and his name won. Notice the narrative structure. Things must get maximally worse before God acts, and this darkest before dawn pattern becomes a template. If 2nd Zechariah provided the narrative skeleton, Joel filled it with the most vivid apocalyptic imagery in the Hebrew Bible. Joel, probably the latest prophetic book in the canon, opens with a devastating locust plague that doubles as a metaphor for military invasion. And this disaster precedes what Joel calls the Day of the Lord, and the concept originates earlier in Amos, but Joel transforms it into something far more cosmic. Right? In chapter 2, God pours out spear on all flesh. Blood and fire and pillars of smoke fill the earth. The sun turns to darkness. The moon turns to blood. Yet a remnant survives on Mount Zion. Then in chapter 4, Joel names the site of final judgment, the Valley of Jehoshaphat. The name itself means God will judge. There, God renders verdict on the nations. Afterward, permanent protection for God's people and paradise of abundance. Step back and notice what these texts have constructed together. A repeatable sequence, warning signs, then cosmic disturbances, then nations gathering against Jerusalem, then near total destruction, then divine intervention, then judgment of the wicked, then paradise for the righteous. This is the eschatological script that later literature, Daniel, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Book of Revelation, will inherit and elaborate. The eschatological turn was born from disappointment, but its consequences reshaped Western religion. First, it introduced a new relationship with time. History is no longer open-ended. It has a destination, a final day when all wrongs are righted. Second, it reframed suffering. Present misery is not evidence of God's absence, but a necessary prelude to God's intervention. The worse things get, the closer the end. Third, it created the conceptual architecture for apocalypticism, the genre that dominated the last centuries BCE and profoundly shaped early Christianity, rabbinic Judaism, and Islam. Daniel, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Book of Revelation, all inherit the template these late prophetic voices assembled. 3rd Isaiah, 2nd Zechariah, and Joel wrote from the margins of a small, struggling community under Persian rule. Yet the framework they forged, cosmic endpoint, final battle, remade creation, became one of the most enduring ideas in Western religious history. When history disappointed, the prophetic imagination leapt beyond history altogether.